Canada has had a female prime minister, several female premiers, but only one recently appointed female bank chair. Our next guest, through her career and current efforts, is working to change that. Here is Alberta Cefis. She's a former banking executive and board director, and we welcome you here to TVO for the first time. It's nice to meet you.
Well, thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here, Steve.
Let's just start with a bit about your background. You're born where?
I was born in Italy and lived in Italy before coming to Canada.
When?
I came to Canada when I was 9 years old, and I continued going back for half of the year, all the way through my university years. And I actually continued with a parallel education process back in Italy and back in Europe. And so it was very much home. It was really bicontinental till I finished my university.
So do you feel more Canadian or more Italian?
You know, I think like many of us that have roots in both places, you feel very anchored in both, and you hope you take the best of what both countries have to offer.
What city in Italy did you live in, or do you
I
live in?
lived in Milano, and also we had a house outside of Venezia.
Terrific. And educated where? What universities?
I was educated, so my primary educational degrees come from here, from McGill, and I did both a bachelor with joint honors at McGill as well as an MBA.
Anything overseas?
I did. I took courses at the universities there throughout the many years, but in fact the degree was issued by McGill.
And how many years in business altogether so far?
So total years in business, too many, but since you're asking, from 1979.
Okay, so 3.5 decades.
That's exactly it, 35 years.
Okay, you've been at it. And the first job you got after you graduated from university was what?
The very first job I got out of university was working in the technology industry, and I was in marketing and sales for Unisys. And from then, a year later, I jumped into banking, and since then I was always in banking, because banking is a very, very broad career. And
what took you there?
What took me there? Well, that was interesting too. One of my professors was asked for names of promising and capable students that would be interested in financial services, and he was actually asked this by two banks. So I had two very interesting offers in the same week.
What city?
At the time, it was in Montreal. They were both in Montreal.
And at the time, so we're talking early 1980s, how many female senior executive banking role models would you have had to look up to?
Well, basically none. And it was also very interesting because financial services in 1980, when I entered in, it was really the bastion, one of the last bastions of male stranglehold. So very male dominated. Very little diversity, both by gender or in terms of anything else, really. And very different also entry points and educational parameters. And most importantly, if you did find women, they were either in non-managerial ranks as working as tellers, and in management, it tended to be confined to areas such as human resources or public affairs.
So no one thought senior executive decision-making role, that kind of thing.
That's exactly it. You'd be hard-pressed to find women running a business, having customers, running a profit and loss statement, making money. Very, very unusual.
Okay. So what are you up to now?
So I recently retired from Scotiabank at the end of the fiscal year in November 2014, and I now am working as a board director on private company boards as well as not-for-profit. I'm also working in my family business more from a strategic oversight opportunity.
And the family business is what?
Real estate development and management in Canada and the US, not in a day-to-day role, but more from a strategic oversight role. And I'm devoting a lot of time to the continued mentorship and championing of women in leadership positions, as well as to one of my great passions, working with arts and culture.
Wonderful. And you made it to Executive Vice President, which is not too bad. for a big bank, right?
Yes, it was an outstanding opportunity to really be part of the CEO's management team, charged with not just running a large global business as I had, but also to be part of the decision-making cadre.
We want to, I mean, one of the reasons we wanted you here was to tap into your expertise on the whole issue of women in banking and the culture within which they are trying to move up the executive ladder. And to that end, I want to read this quote here. This is Sheryl Sandberg and Adam Grant in the New York Times from earlier in January. And here we go. When a woman speaks in a professional setting, she walks a tightrope. Either she's barely heard or she's judged as too aggressive. When a man says virtually the same thing, heads nod in appreciation for his fine idea. As a result, women often decide that saying less is more. Yale psychologist Professor Victoria L. Breskol looked deeper. She asked professional men and women to evaluate the competence of chief executives who voice their opinions more or less frequently. Male executives, who spoke more often than their peers, were rewarded with 10% higher ratings of competence. When female executives spoke more than their peers, both men and women punished them with 14% lower ratings. As this and other research shows, women who worry that talking too much will cause them to be disliked, they are not paranoid. They are often right. First and foremost, I want to find out whether that reflects your experience.
I think it resonates very deeply with me, and I think one of the most obvious answers for it is that, like anything in life, it's the law of numbers. So as long as there are more men at the table in terms of managerial executive meetings, there are more voices to be heard from the men. And I would say that that translates, there's a natural bipolarity in terms of the voices and who gets heard. It's also interesting because from a behavioral perspective, women tend to be more collaborative, more collegiate. So I know that in large meetings, there's a tendency for women to raise their hands to be heard, whereas the men just cut right in.
Barge right
in. And that's just...
But it's one thing, Alberta, for the men to support the men in those circumstances. But that quote suggests that even the women give the men higher scores and the women lower scores under the same circumstances.
Well, I think again, it's you tend to be part of the environment and the construct, right? And so the predominance of the male voices and the male way of expressing themselves in decision makings, and I do notice that, you know, the men talk, there's always a nodding of heads, but even more importantly, I've often been in meetings where a woman will say something that's absolutely a brilliant observation, and it'll just get glossed over. 2 minutes later, a male colleague will pick up the exact same point, pick it straight up, and it's like it's being heard for the first
Everybody's,
time.
whoa, so brilliant observation, et cetera, et cetera.
However, I will say that as you change the management and leadership composition, so do the voices around the table. So the example that I would have is when I ran my last portfolio, which was a global business, global transaction banking across 58 countries, I actually ended up changing the full composition of my leadership team. Half of them were women. And when you have that kind of a construct, half of the voices at the table are female and the person running the business is a female, it brings a different kind of rigor to the discussion.
Let's pursue this a bit because, of course, and they say the same thing about politics, that more women at the table will make a difference, not just in the appearance of a more just and balanced representation, but that there's actually a qualitative difference to how things get done and what gets done. So if the banking culture is sort of default male, how's it different if there are more women at the table?
So I think the banking culture as a whole has evolved tremendously since I started. Women do run businesses now, as I did. Women do have P&L responsibility. They do manage large client bases, and they are getting to the top echelons, i.e. to those positions of power and influence where they're sitting at the CEO's table, and they are finding a voice. But they themselves become important catalysts and change agents confident in changing their own groups and their own discussion. And I think one of the things that resonates particularly with me is the role that women themselves play in changing that diversity of thinking and of participation at the table. And, you know, to get back to your example about the conversation, a lot has to do with also who's chairing the meeting. So if someone is an effective chair, they'll make sure that everybody is heard, that there is a voice at the table, that the diversity of thinking is brought out.
Is that more likely to happen if a woman is chairing the meeting than if a man is?
I think women have different skills in communication, and one of their great skills is that they tend to be more participative. So they generally do look around the table to hear every voice, not just some voices. I think the other part is that by nature they tend to be more collaborative, so they focus on collaborative approach to problem solving or to a resolution to a specific issue. And I think they're also better listeners. That tends to be usually a female trait.
Can you give me an example of how you, during the course of your 3.5 decades in banking, might have faced discrimination along the way?
Well, I think the interesting part is, on the one hand, I wouldn't have gotten to where I did, to that position of running a complex global business with a very large P&L, with customers and staff in 58 countries, if I hadn't had tremendous supporters and mentors and sponsors along the way.
Who were men?
Who were men, absolutely, all the way through. I don't recall other than once having had a woman boss in very, very short periods. So, you know, on the one side, I wouldn't be there if it wasn't that other people believed in me. On the other side, there are going to be obviously biases and prejudices, whether it's from your peer group, whether it's from people who report to you, although that tends to be less, or from people higher up the organizational pyramid. What I would suggest to you is that a lot of times those biases, people aren't even aware that they have them. And so, you know, some of the things we see all the time is, even these days across all industries, is women can even start out of recruitment in the same proportion as men, mainly because women nowadays are a higher percentage of university graduates than male. But over time, the promotions go more quickly to the men than the women, even though there's very good scientific research that shows they have better performance appraisals.
But and I want, for sure, and I wonder though if at some point during your career, you know, you might have overheard two men having a discussion about your prospects in which one of them said, well, you know, I'd love to give her the job, but, you know, she's probably got to go home early every day and cook supper for her husband. I mean, do you run into that kind of sexism on the job?
Way, way back, yes, or about being on the mommy track. I guess I was a little bit different because I always had jobs that did take me out from where I worked. I was always traveling because I didn't have children. I was always the one that could also work the late evenings and could come in on weekends. So those are the types of gender bias that were truer then. I don't think they're quite there now.
Well, all right, let me follow up on that because you just told us you didn't have kids. And I wonder whether you could have had the kind of career in banking and got as high up the food chain as you did had you had children.
So I would suggest that when I was in banking, or for that matter in many businesses in those days, with the kind of aspirations that I had and the commitment that I had to my job, it would have been very difficult. And mine was a very personal choice that I made because both myself and my husband at that time had very busy careers and we both traveled a lot. So I was always of the school, you can't do everything and have everything, so you make choices and you live with them. I will say though that for my female peer group in those days, and a lot of scientific work also went into this from Harvard and so on, most of the women were single or divorced or didn't have kids. And I definitely know I had girlfriends who were very committed, like I was, to a career, and they would have that first child, and this is unheard of these days, but they would be back at work within 1 week.
Of having given birth?
Of having given birth or two, because they wanted to show their bosses and the men that they were serious about their career. Now, I can tell you that I've had many women work for me throughout the years and who have been part of my leadership group, and that mentality has completely changed, and it's perfectly understood that women can go have a family, be with their child in that very important first year and come back. But interestingly, Steve, what I would say is I've had a lot of men who have done that too in the last 10, 12 years, which would have been unheard of when I started.
So humanizing the workplace isn't just good for women, it's good for men too, obviously.
It is, because men now feel comfortable in saying, you know, I've talked about it with my wife, and because of where we are, it's better for me to stay home and look after the child this first year. That would have been, the other men wouldn't have allowed men to do that back in 1980, 1970.
But now they do?
They do.
More so now.
Much more so. And it's
Let me tap into your experience in terms of what you think makes for a great leader, because no doubt you've seen your share over the years. What makes the good ones good?
So many things go into leadership, but I think if I'm going to talk about what resonated with me through my leadership style and with the people that I have great respect and admiration for, is the first, to be a great leader, it's not enough to have IQ, but you need EQ, emotional quotient. And it's always surprising how that at times is a missing aspect in someone's leadership model. So EQ and IQ. But the other thing that I think is really important for a good leader to have is a sense of vision of where they want to go, how they're going to get there in terms of strategy, and then that ability to execute and to make things happen. And in doing that, good leadership realizes that it's never about yourself, it's about that ability to inspire others to be great teams, to do great things.
Do you have to be liked to be a good leader?
I absolutely think that has to be the case, because to be a leader, frankly, you need followers, and people need to follow you because they have a reason. They like where you're going, they like your vision, they like what you're going to accomplish, they like the fact that they can make a difference in what they're doing. And so I do believe you need to have respect for your leader, and you need to like them. You
know, the best line about leadership I think I heard was just the other day. John Boehner, the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, said, if you're a leader and nobody's following you, you're just a guy out for a walk. See, they do have to follow, don't they? You do have to inspire them to follow you.
That's right, and I think, you know, one of the management mantras these days is everybody is a leader. And everyone is in some aspects of their own lives, not just professionally or personally. But if you look at the managerial construct of what is leadership, it cannot work unless there are followers and people to lead.
Alberta, it's been a great pleasure meeting you. Thanks so much for coming into TVO tonight and sharing some of your views. This is the former Executive Vice President, Head of Global Transaction Banking for Scotiabank, Alberta Cefis. Mille grazie, signora.
Prego, Steve. Buona giornata.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.